This CLE course is going to look at some of the origins of voter suppression in the United States and how small changes to election laws can impact people's ability to register, vote, and have their vote counted. We're going to go briefly through a background on the historical origins of voter suppression, talk about the federal constitutional and statutory protections of the right to vote, look at some recent periods in history and recent history and how we saw the protection for the right to vote ebb and flow both in the federal and the state courts, and then look at some current challenges underway that will have a significant impact in the upcoming election and future elections for the strength of protection for people's right to vote. Very briefly, I'm going to start in the late 1800s with the Military Reconstruction Act, the requirement that Southern states who had lost the Civil War needed to pass new state constitutions, giving the right to vote to Black Americans in order to rejoin the Union. States were also required to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to be readmitted to the Union. And what we're going to focus on here is the 14th and 15th Amendment as the building blocks of voting rights protection and voting-related litigation in present day. The two significant sections of the 14th Amendment, first is Section 1, which covers equal protection and due process. Both provisions are used often to make sure that there's equality in protection for voting rights, whether that's on the basis of race or just confirming that similarly situated voters will be treated the same way. And due process protection as it relates to voting rights protects people from losing their right to vote or having their ballot not count without notification or an opportunity to cure any defect in their ballot. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment is one of the bases for denying people the right to vote or removing their right to vote due to a felony conviction, and I will talk about that at the end of this program. As far as the 15th Amendment, it's the basis for intentional discrimination claims, which is one of the ways that we challenge some voting restrictions. And it also, Section 2 of the 15th Amendment is the authorization for Congress to enforce the 15th Amendment by way of passage of legislation. It is what authorizes the Voting Rights Act and gave Congress the ability to pass the Voting Rights Act, which again is another one of the significant federal restrictions on voter suppression, or put differently, one of the significant federal protections for the right to vote is the Voting Rights Act. We're going to look mostly at modern day barriers to the right to vote, but it's important to understand historically some of the first generation barriers. And those were things like poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. Those first generation barriers to voting were rather explicit in attempting to prevent Black Americans from exercising their right to vote. The more recent tools are, in fact, more subtle. So you have a number of restrictions on the right to vote now that have a racially discriminatory impact, even if they were not passed with the intent to discriminate on the basis of race. It's helpful to keep in mind as we talk through some of the second generation barriers to voting that the first generation barriers are in our country's lived experience. So in a case that I worked on in 2014, NAACP v. Mccrory, a challenge to an omnibus election bill in North Carolina, one of our plaintiffs, Ms. Rosanelle Eaton, she actually recalls when she registered to vote in the South in 1939 and was forced to recite the preamble to the Constitution in attempt to prevent an African-American woman from voting. So these explicitly discriminatory devices are in our country's lived history, and more subtle devices to exclude or prevent people from voting certainly continue to occur to this day. So let's jump in to talk through some of the federal protections that we have for the right to vote and how voting rights attorneys deploy those federal protections to try to push back against voter suppression that we see at the state level.